A listener note. This episode talks about slavery in early Toronto. It includes descriptions of violence, forced confinement, and racial injustice. Slavery in this region affected both Indigenous and Black people. While Indigenous enslavement was widespread in early colonial Canada, this episode focuses primarily on the experiences of Black people held in bondage in and around York. Some listeners may find parts of this episode difficult. Listener discretion is advised.
It's March 1793. You're a farmer in York. Your spread is a modest patch of clear forest near the Don River, mostly stumps, mosquitoes, and ambition. Your days are a cycle of aching shoulders, hauling timber, tending to a few head of cattle, and prepping the soil for the spring planting. It's a hard life, but it's yours. Today you're making the trek into the little town site to get supplies. The air is biting, that raw Lake Ontario cold that seeps through your wool coat and settles into your marrow. You're near the shoreline when you hear it. A struggle, not just a scuffle, but a scene of pure, desperate violence. You stop the cart and look towards the bank. You see three men, their faces flushed red with the effort, dragging a woman towards a small boat tied to the freezing water. Your heart drops because you recognize her. Her name is Chloe Cooley. You don't know her well, but you've seen her around the market while you're selling your parsnips. Most days she's focused and busy, but last autumn when a crate tumbled off your cart and apples rolled into the muck, she was the one who stopped. She helped you gather them, handed you a particularly red one, and gave you a quick, bright smile before disappearing back into the crowd. She is a Black woman, enslaved by a local loyalist named Adam Ruman, and she is fighting for her life. This isn't a quiet abduction. Chloe is a whirlwind. She's screaming, clawing at their eyes, and using every inch of her strength to stay on this side of the river. She kicks the side of the boat so hard you think the wood might splinter. It takes all three men to finally overpower her, forcing her down into the mud, binding her wrists and ankles with coarse rope until she's immobile. They toss her into the bottom of the boat like a sack of grain. You stand there, frozen. You aren't the only one. There are other farmers and merchants nearby. Everyone is watching. You can feel the collective shock, a heavy, shameful silence that only breaks with the sound of her muffled cries as the boat pushes off towards the American shore. Ruman is selling her to a stranger across the water. Later, the guilt brings you to the authorities. You and another witness, a free Black man named Peter Martin, stand before Lieutenant Governor John Graves Simcoe, the highest-ranking official in Upper Canada and a man who has publicly condemned slavery. You tell him exactly what you saw, the ropes, the struggle, the sheer inhumanity of it. Simcoe is horrified. He wants to abolish slavery in Upper Canada right there and then. But as you walk out of that meeting and back to your muddy farm, the wind changes. You hear the whispers in the local taverns, the powerful men of York, the ones with the big estates and the names we still put on our street signs today. They aren't horrified. They're furious. Not at Ruman for the kidnapping, but at Simcoe for trying to take away their property. You thought you lived in a place where things were changing, but today you saw the truth. Slavery is thriving in Toronto, and its violence isn't hidden. It's happening in public, in daylight, in your own city.
It's a hard thing to admit that slavery happened here in Toronto, not the American South, not a history textbook, here.
Most people imagine this city as a destination, a place where people found freedoms, and that did happen. But in the early 1800s, some were desperate to leave. The kind of violence we associate with other places lived here too.
We hear stories about the Underground Railroad. We celebrate freedom seekers who made it across the border. But there's a silence around the fact that Black and Indigenous people were legally enslaved in the city, in homes, on farms, and in the streets.
This episode isn't about guilt, it's about memory. It's about looking directly at the early foundations of Toronto and asking what we've been taught to ignore.
Because long before storefronts and neighborhoods took root, before churches and small businesses shaped community, there were people here held as property. There were lives erased from ledgers, and there was a woman named Chloe whose resistance and removal forced the city to confront itself.
Today, we're looking at slavery in early Toronto. We'll trace how it functioned, who enforced it, and what it meant for the people trapped inside it.
I'm Grayson Miller.
And I'm Adam Weiser.
And this is Muddy York.
During the American Revolution, not everyone in the 13 colonies supported independence. Thousands of people remained loyal to the British Crown. They were merchants, farmers, soldiers, and enslavers who believed in British law, feared political instability, or simply had more to lose than gain from rebellion. As the Revolution dragged on, and especially after the British defeat in 1783, these loyalists became targets. Their property was confiscated, their homes were attacked, some were imprisoned or publicly humiliated. Others were forced to flee. So they left. Entire families packed what they could and headed north, crossing rivers, trekking through forests, or sailing along the Atlantic to reach British-controlled lands. The Crown, eager to reward their loyalty and reinforce its hold on the Canadian frontier, welcomed them. They offered them land grants, tools, food, and financial aid to help them start again. Some of them landed in Nova Scotia or New Brunswick. Others pushed inland into what would soon become Upper Canada. But the Loyalists didn't come north alone. Many brought enslaved people with them. This wasn't accidental. In 1790, the British government passed legislation allowing settlers to bring enslaved people into Upper Canada and assigned each one a monetary value of 40 shillings. Slavery was authorized by the state and enforced through law. From that point forward, Upper Canada treated slavery as a legitimate legal and economic practice. Enslaved men and women were listed in estate records, shipping manifests, and bills of sale. Their names, when recorded, appeared alongside oxen, tools, and parcels of land. In the settlement of York, later known as Toronto, these people lived and labored under constant supervision, but they contributed to the city's earliest growth in ways that were rarely recorded or acknowledged. When they escaped or resisted, local newspapers printed reward notices. Sometimes their names were reduced to a single word like John or Sue, along with a vague description of their clothes and the payment offered for their return. These were not abstract figures, though. These were people living in the cold, muddy outposts of early York. They were a part of the city's origins, even if we're rarely told about them.
York in the 1790s was not the bustling city we know today. It was little more than a fortified outpost along the shore of Lake Ontario. Forests stretched for miles in every direction. Marshland hugged the edges of the settlement. Farmland had to be carved out acre by acre from the dense tree cover. The British military had established a presence here, and a few colonial administrators had set up wooden buildings along rough, muddy roads that turned to sludge every time it rained. This was not a city. It was a frontier hub, and yet, even in this rugged environment, a rigid social order was already forming. Slavery was part of that order. Slavery in Upper Canada did not resemble the massive plantations of the American South. There were no cotton fields here, no sprawling estates filled with dozens or hundreds of enslaved workers. The climate and economy were different, but slavery was still present, and it took a different form. In most cases, it was concentrated in elite households. Wealthy families in York might have had one or two enslaved people living under their roof.
These individuals worked in close proximity to the families who claimed to own them. They cooked meals over open hearths. They scrubbed floors on their hands and knees. They washed linens in icy water hauled in from nearby rivers. Some of them were skilled tradespeople, blacksmiths who forged tools and horseshoes, carpenters who repaired barns, homes, and wagons. Others tended animals, harvested small crops, or worked behind the scenes in emerging markets and shops. Their labor was woven into the daily rhythm of the colony. Every household task, every repaired door hinge or planted row of vegetables might have been done by an enslaved person. Their work helped make the colony functional. The fact that enslaved people lived so close to their enslavers did not mean they were treated more humanely. In many cases, it made control more complete. There was no distance between the person who ordered your labor and the person who decided your punishment. In York, a woman named Peggy lived and worked inside the household of Peter Russell, the colony's top administrator. When she resisted his authority, he had her confined in the local jail. Later, he advertised her and her young son for sale in the town, warning other enslaved people what could happen if you did not obey. The same man who governed the province exercised complete control over her daily life. These conditions that created strife for Peggy and other enslaved people were not created by marginal figures operating at the edges of society. Some of the most prominent people in early Toronto actively enslaved others. As we mentioned, Peter Russell was the province's top administrator, and Peggy was not his only slave. He had many. William Jarvis, whose name now marks a downtown street, enslaved people in his home near present-day Queen Street. Colonel James Gray, the colony's first Solicitor General, was also a slaveholder. Slavery functioned as a norm among the elite. 6 of the 16 men in Upper Canada's first parliament owned enslaved people. These were individuals writing laws, forming courts, and laying the foundations of government, shaping the colony's political future while claiming ownership over other human beings.
In 1793, a system that relied on quiet enforcement became publicly visible. In a colony where slavery was upheld by lawmakers, administrators, and respected families, it rarely called public disruption. It operated quietly, reinforced by custom and law. Most acts of control happened behind doors, inside households, or far from witnesses. The system relied on silence as much as force. Until that silence was broken. Near the Niagara River, an enslaved black woman named Chloe Cooley was seized by the man who claimed ownership over her, a loyalist named Adam Vrooman. What happened there followed the logic of the system she was trapped inside. Vrooman planned to sell Chloe across the river in the United States, where she would no longer fall under Upper Canada's authority. Once she crossed that river, she would be beyond its courts, its records, and its willingness to intervene. The violence at the shoreline was not an exception, it was the mechanism through which slavery was enforced. This is where the episode began. At the shoreline, at the sound of shouting, watching a woman being dragged toward the water. What unfolded at the river stood out because of resistance. The plan itself was familiar. Enslaved people were sold across borders routinely, often without notice or record. What changed here was refusal. Chloe Cooley did not submit quietly. According to testimony later preserved by the Ontario Heritage Trust, she fought the man restraining her. She screamed as she was dragged toward the shoreline. She struggled as they bound her with rope and forced her into a waiting boat. The violence did not happen behind doors or at night. It took place in broad daylight, in front of others, in a colony that preferred to imagine itself as orderly and controlled. That exposure carried consequences. People talked about what they had witnessed. A man named William Grizzly described the scene to Peter Martin, a free black man and former soldier. Martin recognized what the incident revealed. Legal status could vanish in minutes. Protection could end at the water's edge. Rather than allowing the account to fade, Martin carried it forward. He brought it to the highest authority in the colony. When Lieutenant Governor John Graves Simcoe heard the account, He treated it as evidence of how slavery actually operated in the colony. The violence at the shoreline was not hidden or exceptional. It reflected a system that relied on force, public compliance, and legal indifference. The incident made it difficult for the government to continue treating slavery as a private matter.
What happened to Chloe started the change. The violence was witnessed. As we mentioned, it was discussed. It moved beyond rumor. The exposure made it more difficult for the government to continue treating slavery as something outside its concern. When the account reached the colonial administration, it arrived at a moment when Upper Canada was still defining itself. The colony was young, and its leaders were preoccupied with reputation. They wanted to be seen within the British Empire as orderly, principled, and stable. Public violence carried out to enforce human ownership undermined that image. Recognition of the problem, however, did not produce agreement on a solution. The response unfolded slowly and unevenly. Debate followed. Resistance followed. Much of it came from men whose wealth and authority were tied directly to the continuation of slavery. Some urged caution. Others warned against interference. What emerged was not consensus, but pressure. For the first time, the government was pushed to address slavery through legislation rather than custom. With the news about Chloe, John Graves Simcoe argued for abolition. He believed slavery contradicted British law and moral authority, and he understood that the colony's standing was at risk. But Simcoe did not govern alone. He faced a legislature filled with men who enslaved others, men whose influence depended on preserving the system. The result was a compromise. In 1973, the legislature passed what would become known as the Act to Limit Slavery. The wording reflected its political constraints. The law did not compromise freedom. It sought to restrict an entrenched system while avoiding direct confrontation with those who benefited from its survival.
The act itself was cautious in scope and shaped by political pressure. One provision prohibited the importation of any new enslaved people into Upper Canada. Settlement was still underway at this time. Loyalist families continued to arrive, and without such restriction, slavery could have expanded alongside population growth. The ban halted that possibility by placing a firm ceiling on the system, ensuring the number of enslaved people could not increase beyond those already held. The act also confirmed that people already held in slavery would remain enslaved. That provision sat at the center of the political compromise behind the legislation. Colonial authorities chose not to challenge what enslavers framed as existing property rights. As a result, the law offered no relief to those already in bondage. Chloe Cooley was not freed by its passage, nor were the hundreds of others living under enslavement across the colony at this time. But the most consequential provision addressed the next generation. Children born to enslaved women after the act came into force could be held in service until the age of 25, after which they were legally free. This provision addressed how slavery reproduced itself over time. In British North America, a child's legal status followed that of their mother, a principle courts consistently upheld. Birth alone was enough to bind a person to a lifetime of unfree labor. What did life actually look like after 1793 for the people still held in bondage? How did freedom function when it existed on paper but not always in practice? And how did a city shaped by slavery begin to transform into one known, later on, as a place of refuge? To understand this shift, we have to look closely at the years that followed, how the law actually played out on the ground.
After the Act to Limit Slavery passed in 1793, daily life changed very little for people already held in bondage in Upper Canada. The law allowed enslavers to retain those claimed as property. Households remained intact, work routines continued, families were still separated, labor remained unpaid, physical punishment remained legal. The promise contained in the law applied only to children born after its passage, and even then, freedom arrived decades later at the age of 25. Survival to that point was uncertain. Records were poorly kept, birth dates were disputed,
Enforcement varied by location and by the willingness of officials to act. For most enslaved people, the law existed on paper, not in the spaces where real life unfolded.
That gap between law and lived experience appears clearly in the historical record. One example is Henry Lewis, who had been enslaved by William Jarvis, a senior colonial official, and the person Jarvis Street is named after. Once the act passed, Lewis escaped to New York. In 1798, he wrote to Jarvis, offering to purchase his own freedom. Even after leaving Upper Canada, Lewis's safety depended on negotiation with the man who had once owned him. That pattern was common. Slavery continued in kitchens, stables, and farmyards under the same families as before. The act did not end those relationships. It placed limits around them. Before 1793, slavery operated largely through habit and inheritance. Afterward, it existed within a defined legal framework. New enslaved people could no longer be imported. Children born into slavery had a legally defined endpoint, however distant. Courts and officials were required to acknowledge slavery as something governed by a law rather than assumption. The result was pressure, but not freedom. The system persisted, but it became harder to expand and harder to justify.
Slavery continued in York until 1834, when it was abolished across the British Empire. In the decades between, legal ownership endured, but confidence in the system weakened. Those early limits shaped how the colony came to be seen. Upper Canada developed a reputation as a place where slavery had been restricted and was gradually disappearing. The perception would later draw people north as conditions in the United States grew more dangerous. As the 19th century progressed, the contrast between the British North America and the United States sharpened. Slavery expanded and hardened south of the border. In Upper Canada, it weakened. Even before abolition, people fleeing bondage began arriving. Some came openly, others arrived quietly. Networks of assistance developed through churches, free Black communities, and sympathetic settlers.
This is where Toronto's most familiar history intersects with a less examined one. Toronto later became known as a destination for freedom seekers connected to the Underground Railroad, a reputation recorded by abolitionists and Black newspapers of the time. As we now know, that story rests on an earlier reality that is often overlooked. Slavery had been practiced here for decades before the city became known as a place of refuge. For free Black residents in York, life remained precarious. Homes were built, businesses opened, churches formed, but kidnapping and forced removal remained real dangers. Agents from the United States crossed the border. Mistaken identity and false claims led to disappearances. When the British Parliament officially abolished slavery across the empire in 1834, ownership of human beings ended under British law. People could no longer be bought or sold. Families could not be legally separated through sale. That change was immediate and binding. What abolition did not undo was the imbalance created by the system itself. Former enslavers retained their land, businesses, and political influence. The British government paid millions of pounds to slave owners across the empire for their losses. British Treasury records show more than 46,000 successful compensation claims. Payments went not only to plantation owners, but to heirs, trustees, and investors living comfortably in Britain. The people who had been enslaved were excluded entirely.
After abolition, the border between Canada and the U.S. took on new significance. As slavery continued in the United States, the laws there became more aggressive and punishments more severe. The reality of having to return to the United States back into that type of bondage was unfathomable for many Blacks living in Upper Canada. Black residents in Toronto lived with the awareness that kidnapping remained a threat. Borders were porous. Slave catchers crossed freely. In 1840, the Toronto Patriot reported that attempts had been made to seize black residents in the city and carry them south. Henry Bibb warned that the colored man in Canada is not free from danger, though slavery does not exist here. Information about how to stay safe in this new reality moved through churches, newspapers, and personal networks. Mary Ann Shadd Cary, the first black woman in North America to publish a newspaper, cautioned readers that reaching Canada did not ensure security, and it was imperative to seek out those who were known and trusted.
How did enslaved people fleeing north find the right people to trust? The established black community in the newly established Toronto quickly became an unflinching resource. Churches became organizing centers, mutual aid societies tracked arrivals and disappearances. Neighbors watched for unfamiliar faces. When someone went missing, word spread quickly. These networks compensated for gaps in enforcement and hesitation by authorities. Toronto became a destination not because it was safe, but because it was safer than elsewhere, and because the community already here worked hard to make survival possible. Because of those informal protection networks, Toronto came to be seen as a place where freedom could be maintained, even if it couldn't be guaranteed. That reputation mattered beyond the people who lived it. It shaped how the city understood itself. As Toronto expanded, civic leaders emphasized an image built around order, progress, and moral distance from the United States, especially the latter. Stories that supported that image were repeated and preserved. Stories that complicated it received less attention. Slavery complicated the picture. It showed that the city had not only sheltered people fleeing bondage, but had once enforced bondage itself, through law, property, and political authority. That history did not disappear, but it survived unevenly. In estate inventories, in court records, in newspaper notices, in names that appeared briefly and then vanished. Chloe Cooley's name survived only because her resistance produced witnesses and documentation. Most enslaved people left no such interruption behind.
Recovering this history changes how Toronto comes into focus, because it shows what the record left out. It reveals that freedom here was unevenly enforced and actively defended. It explains why black communities built institutions early and relied on them heavily. It restores the presence of people whose labor and resistance shaped the city even when their names were not preserved. Remembering slavery in Toronto does not erase the story of refuge. It places it in context. By the time the record grows quiet, Chloe Cooley is gone from Upper Canada. What happened to her after crossing is unknown. What remains is the consequence of her resistance. A system that depended on silence was forced into view. A colony was compelled to legislate what it had long avoided naming. Slavery was limited, not repaired. Lives were altered, not restored. Hey guys, thank you very much for listening to that episode. As a listener note, the reenactments place, well, we can't be 100% sure of what everyone said and how they acted. The reenactments are based on historical research. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. If you have any comments or concerns, feel free to reach out. Guys, remember, we've got 2 new amazing platforms. You can find us at Muddy York Podcast. There's 2 Y's in the middle there, so it's confusing. And we are on TikTok and Instagram. A lot of great videos there. If you want to reach out to us, please shoot us an email to muddy_york@outlook.com. And again, share this episode with your friends and family. Give us 5-star rating, because this is how people get to find out about great Toronto history. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you in a few weeks.